Kian only had one mission: destroy the man who ruined his life. But his plan takes a dangerous turn when he falls for Adrian, the enemy's beautiful and unsuspecting son. Every touch, every kiss, pulls him deeper into a forbidden love that threatens to shatter his revenge. Betrayal, passion, and obsession collide as Kian must choose: break Adrian's heart to get justice, or risk everything to save him. This is a dark BL romance full of secrets, heartbreak, and twisted desire. Subscribe, like, and comment if you want more of this tragic love story. The rain hadn't stopped all week. It beat against the windows of the rundown apartment like an unending reminder that the world outside was thriving, while he sat inside, drowning in memories that wouldn't let him breathe. Kian lit another cigarette. The ashtray beside him was overflowing, but he didn't care. It was the only thing keeping his hands from shaking. 3 years. 3 years since his father's company was torn apart. 3 years since he'd watched bailiffs tear down the family's nameplate from the office building his father had built with his bare hands. 3 years since he'd buried the man who had been his anchor. A quiet funeral with no one but Kian and the empty wind, because their so-called friends had scattered like rats once the empire crumbled. He had been 21. Now he was 24, hollowed out and sharp-edged. And tonight he was finally going to do something about it. The invitation had come in a cream-colored envelope slipped under his apartment door. He had almost thrown it out until he saw the embossed name at the bottom: the Callahan Foundation Gala. The Callahans. The very name tasted like poison in his mouth. Everyone knew who they were: old money, powerful, untouchable. Their patriarch, Damien Callahan, was the man who had orchestrated his father's downfall. Kian had spent 3 years nursing that knowledge, letting it grow like rot inside him, letting it fester until revenge became the only thing that kept him alive. Tonight, the Callahans were hosting their annual charity gala. Tonight, the city's elite would drink champagne under chandeliers while congratulating themselves on their generosity. Tonight, Kian would walk among them, dressed like one of them, and make his move. He crushed the cigarette into the overflowing ashtray and stood. The venue glittered. Crystal chandeliers hung like constellations above the ballroom, scattering light across marble floors. The air hummed with soft jazz, laughter, the clink of glasses. Kian stood near the entrance, his black suit tailored to perfection, a mask of polite charm fixed over his face. He hated every second of it. And then he saw him. Standing by the bar, a glass of champagne in one hand, was Adrian Callahan. The son. The golden boy. The perfect heir. Kian had seen his face in newspapers before. Charity events, polo matches, interviews where he smiled that soft, disarming smile that made reporters swoon. Seeing him in person was something else entirely. Adrian was tall, with a lean, athletic frame, dark hair that looked too perfect to be accidental, and a tailored suit that fit like it was made for him, which it probably was. He carried himself with effortless grace, as though he belonged to the glittering world around him, as though he had never known hunger, grief, or despair. Kian's chest tightened, not with admiration, but with something darker. This is what he took from me, Kian thought. This is the life I should have had. Nee. Adrian laughed at something a woman beside him said, and the sound sent a sharp pang through Kian's chest. He has everything. Everything. But not for long. Kian didn't approach immediately. He circled the room first, keeping Adrian in his periphery, studying him. He noticed how Adrian's smile didn't quite reach his eyes. How, when he wasn't speaking to anyone, his shoulders slumped slightly, his gaze distant. Interesting. Maybe Adrian wasn't as untouchable as he seemed. Kian waited until Adrian was alone, sipping champagne and scanning the room like someone bored out of his mind. Then Kian stepped up beside him. Terrible wine, Kian said casually, plucking a glass from the tray of a passing waiter. Adrian glanced at him, startled, and then smiled faintly. You noticed too? Kian smirked. It's a tragedy. A room full of millionaires and not a decent bottle of champagne in sight. Adrian chuckled, low and warm. Finally, someone says it. I was starting to think I was crazy. Kian tilted his head, letting his gaze linger a second too long. You don't strike me as the type to keep quiet when you're suffering. Adrian's eyes glinted with something like amusement. And you strike me as the type who likes to make trouble. Kian smiled, slow and deliberate. Maybe I do. The air between them shifted, just slightly but enough for Kian to feel it in his chest. Perfect, he thought. He's curious. They spoke for a few minutes, about nothing and everything. Kian kept his answers light, charming, revealing just enough to intrigue Adrian but not enough to be predictable. When Adrian excused himself to take a call, Kian watched him go, every muscle coiled with adrenaline. He had done what he came here to do. The first move had been made. Later, long after the gala ended, Kian found himself standing in front of the mirror in his apartment. Adrian's smile haunted him. It wasn't fair. It wasn't supposed to feel like this strange electric pull in his chest. He clenched his fists, forcing the feeling down. This wasn't about feelings. This wasn't about him. This was about revenge. And Adrian Callahan was just the weapon he was going to use to get it. Kian hadn't expected Adrian to actually reach out. For 2 days, he replayed their brief exchange at the gala, wondering if he'd imagined the glint of interest in Adrian's eyes. It would have been fine if it ended there, one spark, one meeting. He could have walked away, focused on the next step of his plan, kept everything clean and calculated. But then the message came. You were right about the wine. Want to find somewhere that serves the good stuff? Kian stared at the glowing screen in the dark of his apartment, cigarette smoke curling around him. He should have deleted it. This was supposed to be a game he controlled, not one where the other player got to choose the next move. Instead he typed back. Tell me when and where. The wine bar Adrian chose was quiet, tucked between a florist's shop and a closed cafe. A place for people who wanted to disappear into the night. Adrian was already there, seated at a corner table, 2 glasses poured. He wasn't in a suit this time, just a black shirt with the top button undone, sleeves rolled to his forearms, dark jeans that made him look less like a Callahan and more like some stranger Kian could almost imagine not hating. Glad you came, Adrian said, his smile soft but a little nervous. Kian slid into the seat across from him, letting his gaze travel lazily over him before answering. You said there'd be good wine. I couldn't resist. Adrian's laugh was quiet, almost relieved. You strike me as someone who doesn't resist much of anything. Kian tilted his glass, smirking. You might be surprised. They drank. At first, the conversation stayed light. Wine preferences, bad gala stories, shallow jokes about the ridiculousness of old money social events. But as the minutes stretched into hours, something shifted. Adrian started talking about things Kian hadn't expected him to share. About his childhood, growing up in a house that looked perfect but felt cold. About the constant pressure of being a Callahan, the endless expectation to be flawless. It's like, every choice I make, every person I see, it's already being judged before I even open my mouth, Adrian said, his finger tracing the rim of his glass. Sometimes I wonder what I'd be like if I wasn't a Callahan. If I was just me. Kian studied him, a strange ache rising in his chest. This was supposed to be easy. It was supposed to be simple. But here was Adrian, peeling himself open with a vulnerability that made Kian's chest feel too tight. Maybe you'd be exactly the same, Kian said softly. Just freer. Adrian looked at him for a long moment, something raw flickering across his face, before smiling faintly. Freer sounds nice. By the time they left the wine bar, the streets were empty, the city lights painting the pavement gold. They walked side by side, close enough for their arms to brush. When they reached Adrian's building, he hesitated, glancing at Kian like he wasn't sure if he was about to cross a line. Do you want to come up? It was a question that should have been easy to answer. This is what you wanted, Kian reminded himself. This is the plan. But his pulse jumped anyway, and when he said yes, it sounded more like surrender than strategy. Adrian's apartment was a surprise. Kian had expected the sterile opulence of a Callahan penthouse, but instead, the space was warm and personal. There were books stacked on the coffee table, a worn leather jacket thrown over a chair, a painting on the wall that looked like it was done by hand rather than bought at auction. This isn't what I imagined, Kian said as he stepped inside. Adrian raised an eyebrow, amused. And what exactly did you imagine? Marble floors. White leather sofas. Someone waiting with a glass of whiskey the moment you walk in. Adrian laughed, shaking his head. That's my father's place. This is mine. Kian took a slow step closer, his voice low. Better? Adrian's expression softened. You're dangerous, you know that? Kian tilted his head. And you don't look scared. Adrian swallowed, gaze flicking down to Kian's lips before coming back up. Maybe I am. The kiss was inevitable. Adrian leaned in slowly, like he was giving Kian a chance to turn away. Kian didn't move, didn't even breathe, until Adrian's mouth brushed his, gentle and hesitant. Then something in Kian broke. He kissed back hard enough to make Adrian gasp, his hand coming up to cup the back of Adrian's neck, pulling him closer. It wasn't careful anymore. They stumbled into the bedroom, pulling at each other's clothes, leaving a trail across the floor. Kian pressed Adrian against the wall, bracing his arms on either side of him, breathing hard. Tell me to stop, Kian said, voice low and rough. Adrian's chest heaved. Don't stop. It was fire after that. Kian's hands roamed everywhere, memorizing the shape of him, the way his skin felt warm under his palms. Adrian responded with quiet, desperate sounds that made Kian's control slip with every passing second. This was supposed to be power, supposed to be about control, about turning Adrian into something breakable. But the way Adrian touched him, like Kian was the only thing in the room, like he was something precious, it twisted something deep inside him. They moved together with a kind of urgency that bordered on reckless, a hunger that had nothing to do with revenge and everything to do with the way they made each other feel alive. When it was over, they collapsed into the sheets, sweat cooling on their skin, breaths ragged. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Adrian shifted, resting his head on Kian's shoulder, his fingers brushing lazily against Kian's chest. You make it quiet, he murmured. Kian blinked at the ceiling. What? Adrian's voice was soft, almost drowsy. My head. You make it quiet. Kian's throat tightened. This was supposed to feel like a win. It was supposed to feel like the first step in dismantling the Callahans from the inside out. Instead, it felt like standing on the edge of a cliff, staring into something he wasn't sure he could climb back from. When Adrian whispered, "Stay," Kian almost said no. But he stayed. And for the first time in 3 years, Kian was afraid of what came next. For weeks, Kian told himself he was still in control. He visited Adrian's apartment almost every night now, sometimes leaving before dawn, sometimes staying until morning and sharing coffee in silence. They cooked together once, or rather Adrian cooked while Kian leaned against the counter pretending to be amused instead of unnerved by how easily the domesticity slipped into place. This wasn't supposed to feel normal. It wasn't supposed to feel like home. One night, Adrian was sitting cross-legged on the couch, flipping through a sketchbook when Kian walked in. You draw? Kian asked, feigning casual curiosity as he tossed his jacket onto a chair. Adrian's ears turned pink. Badly. Don't look too close. Kian sat beside him, taking the sketchbook anyway. The pages were full of quick charcoal sketches, city streets, a stray cat, people at cafes, and one that made Kian's chest tighten. Adrian himself, seen in a mirror, shoulders hunched, looking exhausted. You're good, Kian said softly, surprising himself with the sincerity in his voice. Adrian gave him a faint, almost shy smile. My father thinks it's a waste of time. Kian looked at him sharply. Your father sounds like a prick. Adrian laughed, but there was no humor in it. He thinks anything that doesn't build the Callahan name is useless. Kian's jaw tightened. Good, he thought viciously. Hate him. Hate him like I do. But Adrian didn't hate him, not enough anyway. And that made Kian's next move even crueler. The plan had been simple. Get close to Adrian, make him fall, then use that trust to expose his father's hypocrisy in the most public, devastating way possible. And now Kian had everything he needed. He'd gathered information, whispers Adrian had let slip when he was tired or drunk, documents Kian had stolen from Adrian's home office when he was asleep, evidence of shady business deals, of bribes and corporate sabotage, enough to ruin Damien Callahan permanently. The revenge he'd dreamed of for years was finally within reach. So why did it feel like his chest was splitting open every time Adrian smiled at him? A storm broke the night everything came crashing down. Adrian was curled on the couch under a blanket, barefoot, waiting for Kian. There was wine on the table, music playing softly from the speakers. When Kian walked in, drenched from the rain, Adrian grinned at him like he was the only person that mattered. And that look, was what undid him. He almost turned back, almost abandoned the plan right then and there. But the weight of everything he'd lost, his father, his home, his future, dragged him forward. You're late, Adrian said teasingly, standing to greet him. But Kian didn't smile. Adrian, he said, voice rough. We need to talk. Adrian frowned, suddenly cautious. What's wrong? Kian hesitated. The words caught in his throat. He could still stop this. He could burn the evidence, walk away, protect Adrian from what was about to happen. But then he remembered his father's face in the hospital bed, the way his hands had trembled as he signed the last of their assets away, broken by Damien Callahan. This, Kian said, pulling the folder from his coat pocket and throwing it onto the coffee table, is what's wrong. Adrian opened it, and froze. Inside were copies of confidential emails, bank statements, transactions that painted a damning picture of his father's empire. What is this? Adrian's voice was barely above a whisper. The truth, Kian said flatly. Everything your father's done. How he built his fortune. How he destroyed mine. Adrian looked up slowly, confusion turning to horror. How do you even have this? Kian didn't flinch. Because I planned this. All of it. From the moment I met you. The silence that followed was unbearable. Adrian stared at him as though he didn't recognize him anymore. You're lying, he said finally, but his voice cracked. Tell me you're lying. Kian's throat burned. I'm not. Adrian laughed, a broken, ugly sound. So I was just a target? A way to get to him. Yes. The word tasted like blood. Adrian flinched as though Kian had hit him. The argument that followed was a blur of shouted words, anger and heartbreak twisting together until Kian could barely tell which was which. You used me. Adrian's voice shook with rage. Every night, every kiss, every time he broke off, his chest heaving. Was any of it real? Kian opened his mouth, closed it, then forced the lie out. No. Adrian's face went cold. Get out. Kian didn't move. Get out. The fallout was swift and merciless. By morning, Damien Callahan had the folder. The man didn't yell, didn't need to. His fury was a quiet, cutting thing, the kind that left no survivors. Within 24 hours, Kian's name was dragged through every news outlet, painted as a vindictive liar who had seduced Adrian for money and revenge. And Adrian didn't say a word to defend him. When Kian saw him again, it was by accident, at a charity luncheon a week later. Adrian's expression was a mask of ice when their eyes met. Kian tried to speak, but Adrian cut him off with a single venomous whisper as he brushed past him. You wanted to destroy me. Congratulations, you did. And then he was gone. That night, Kian sat in his apartment, staring at the folder of evidence that had started everything. He'd won. Damien Callahan's reputation was in tatters, his deals collapsing. But the victory tasted like ash. The bed beside him was empty. And for the first time, Kian wondered if revenge had been worth the cost. Kian didn't leave his apartment for days. The city outside moved on, headlines screaming about the Callahan scandal one day and forgetting it the next. The empire Damien Callahan had built over decades was crumbling. Board members resigned. Lawsuits piled up. Competitors circled like vultures. It should have been satisfying. Instead, Kian lay awake at night, replaying the last look on Adrian's face over and over until it drove him half mad. He'd thought betrayal would feel like victory. Instead, it felt like carving out his own heart with a dull knife. On the fourth night, he found himself outside Adrian's building without remembering how he'd gotten there. He stood in the rain, staring up at the windows until his clothes clung to him like a second skin. Finally, he went inside, ignoring the security guard's suspicious look, taking the elevator up to Adrian's floor. When Adrian opened the door, he froze. He looked different, thinner, harder around the edges. The soft glow in his eyes was gone, replaced by something colder, like glass ready to shatter. Kian. His voice was flat, empty. I need to talk to you, Kian said, rain dripping from his hair, his voice rough. Please. Adrian hesitated before stepping aside wordlessly, letting him in. The apartment was spotless now, stripped of warmth. The sketchbook that had once sat on the coffee table was gone, the shelves rearranged like he was erasing pieces of himself. Kian stood awkwardly, hands clenched at his sides. I didn't come here to justify anything. I need you to know I'm sorry. Adrian laughed, a sound so sharp it made Kian flinch. You're sorry? Yes. Adrian shook his head slowly, disbelief etched across his face. You broke me, Kian. Do you get that? You didn't just ruin my father, you ruined me. Kian swallowed hard, his chest aching. I never meant to. Yes, you did, Adrian snapped. His voice was rising now, shaking with anger and something rawer underneath. Every kiss, every night you stayed, every time I thought. He stopped, his throat working like the words were too painful to finish. Kian stepped closer, desperate. Adrian, I love you. Adrian's breath caught, just for a second, before his expression hardened. Love? He said bitterly. You don't get to say that word to me. The silence that followed was suffocating. Kian's hands trembled. I can fix this, he said finally, voice breaking. I'll go public, I'll take the blame, Adrian shook his head. This was never about the public. It was about us. And you killed that. Kian's throat closed. I just wanted to make him pay. You did, Adrian said quietly. You wanted to destroy him and you did. But you destroyed me too. And the worst part. Kian looked at him helplessly. Adrian's voice cracked as he whispered, I still love you. And I hate myself for it. Kian's heart twisted painfully. Then we can try again. We can start over. No. The word was final. Adrian stepped back, putting distance between them. You need to leave, Kian. And this time don't come back. Kian felt something inside him collapse. He wanted to fight, to beg, to fall to his knees if he had to, but the look in Adrian's eyes stopped him cold. It wasn't anger anymore. It wasn't even hate. It was emptiness. Adrian had nothing left to give him. Kian left without another word. Outside, the rain was still falling, heavy and relentless. He walked until his legs ached, until the streets blurred into nothing but light and shadow. When he finally returned to his apartment, it felt smaller than ever, a box filled with ghosts. He opened the folder of evidence one last time, staring at the papers that had cost him everything. Then, without thinking, he tore them apart, shredding each page until the floor was covered in white confetti, until there was nothing left to prove he had ever won. Weeks passed. Damien Callahan's downfall was complete. The man had been forced out of his company, his reputation in ruins. The media moved on to the next scandal. But Kian didn't. He saw Adrian everywhere. In the cafe where they'd once eaten breakfast, in the park where Adrian had kissed him under the trees, in the reflection of shop windows when he walked by. Every memory was a knife. And yet, if someone had offered him a chance to undo it all, to give back his revenge in exchange for Adrian's forgiveness, he would have done it without hesitation. But there were no second chances. The last time Kian saw Adrian, it was by accident, at a distance across a busy street. Adrian was walking with someone Kian didn't recognize, his hair a little longer, his face pale but composed. He was smiling, faintly but enough to tell Kian that he was learning to live without him. Kian didn't call out. He just stood there, watching until Adrian disappeared into the crowd, until there was nothing left but the echo of what they'd been. That night, Kian sat by the window of his apartment, a cigarette burning between his fingers, the city lights flickering below. He whispered into the empty room, voice raw. I won. And I lost everything. And this time there was no one left to hear him.